Thank you, Allison, for the wonderful introduction. And thanks to BMRC for the wonderfully funding my research and for this opportunity to share my research. And thanks to all of you for being here. It means a lot to me. I know most of the people in here, so they're mostly my friends. It's been an amazing month in Chicago. It's been a month already. I went for a run for a few miles this morning and went straight into the water. It was the best thing you can do. The people say it's the best time to be in Chicago, so I'm really happy to be here. My experience has been so amazing that it makes me want to move to Chicago, actually. But then I saw Ohtani make his 40th home run yesterday. I don't know if you've seen it. Yeah, that also made me, I want to live in New York again. I mean, LA again, because I'm an Ohtani fan, not necessarily Dodger fan. In any case, I'll begin. In January 1961, the New Yorker Theater in the Upper West Side of Manhattan presented D.W. Griffith's 1915 silent film, The Birth of a Nation. It is not clear whether there was an underlying political motive involved in the theater's decision to resuscitate the relic of Jim Crow era during the civil rights movement. Surprisingly, however, showing the racist film that glorified the Ku Klux Klan did not generate any protest. During the Birth of Nation's 2-week run, there was, quote, no pickets, as might have been expected in some quarters, unquote, as reported by the Chicago Defender. Despite the theater's closeness to Harlem, NWCP was nowhere to be seen. The Defender speculated that a 34-minute independent film titled The Cry of Jazz, quote, may well have served to balance the program and satisfy those who may have resented witnessing the birth of a nation, unquote. Released in 1959, The Cry of Jazz was the only work of KHTB Productions, a movie production company founded here in Chicago by a group of African Americans. The production team consisted of novelist Mark Kennedy, urban planner Nelam L, mathematician Eugene Titus, and composer Edward Bland, referred to it as a thesis film that, quote, relates the structure of jazz to the structure of Black life in America, unquote. Despite its potential to eclipse The Birth of a Nation, The Cry of Jazz never achieved any commercial success. Aside from Aspersion cast on its shoddy cinematography and wooden acting, it's very wooden acting. You cannot expect the high acting from this film. It's independent. Much of the criticism levied against the film upon its initial release boiled down to the articulation of racial politics. Writing for Esquire, cultural critic Dwight MacDonald dismissed it as, quote, wretched little hymn of racial snobbery that is poorly photographed, stupidly written, and doesn't even have good jazz. We used to call this black chauvinism. I still don't like it, unquote. While film critics Ernest Kallenbach and Dominic Salvatore framed the film as, quote, the first anti-white film made by American Negroes, jazz critic and producer Bob Koster went so far as to describe it, quote, lunatic fringe theories, articulated by some new kind of nut, a PR man for the Black Muslim movement, unquote. The Cry still baffles many viewers today. The public reception remains divided. It is deemed at best a remarkable work of cultural politics ahead of its time, and at worst, an aberration from otherwise racially harmonious sentiments exposed during the civil rights years. Neither, I would argue, is the case. But to make that argument, we have to watch it first. So in my view, the cry of jazz was neither ahead of its time nor an aberration from the civil rights discourse. If anything, it was perfectly on time if you understand the context in which the film was produced. That is 1950s Chicago, and especially right here, Hyde Park. These are some of my arguments. Cry of Jazz is oftentimes seen as semi-documentary, but I would say the Cry of Jazz is more of a semi-autobiographical film than a semi-documentary. The Cry of Jazz also was at once, or at the same time, a product and critique of an interracial haven, segregated city in post-war Chicago. And their commitment to explicating the dialectic nature of jazz in relation to the socioeconomic standing of Black America was more than an assertion of racial identity. It was a manifestation of their determination to break away from the established social order entrenched in the political economy of a racially imbalanced city, while challenging the ideological basis of racial liberalism that gained a foothold in the age of racial integration. That's a long sentence. The producers Kennedy, Hill, Titus, and Bland were all children of the Great Migration. Hill grew up in Gary, Indiana, while the rest of the team spent their childhood on Chicago's South Side. And Edward O. Bland, was the chief architect of the filmmaking project. His father, Edward Sr., was a Marxist literary critic who presumably belonged to the John Reed Club, while his mother, Althea, was a practitioner of Louisiana Voodoo, a syncretic religion prevalent in the Mississippi River Delta region during the early 20th century. As a 7-year-old, Bland favored playing baseball outside over sitting at his father's meeting whose agenda concerned the coming reign of the proletariat, or watching his mother constantly communicating with the deceased. But here, the parents' influence can be found in his work, including The Cry of Jazz. Upon hearing Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring in the early 1940s, he felt within himself an unquenchable zeal for composition. After serving the U.S. Navy during World War II, Bland resumed his journey into composition at the University of Chicago, where he majored in music and philosophy on the GI Bill. For him, attending college was, quote, primarily for the purpose of learning and questioning what was taught there, unquote. And after asking the professor's tough questions many, many times, he was kicked out. He was forced to transfer to American conservative music. While I'm not going to get into the biography of the other three, I want to point out that I have discovered the real name of Mark Kennedy was Joseph Mark Kennedy. Having committed adultery in Madison, Wisconsin in 1943, he was incarcerated for 18 months. And upon the completion of his time, Kennedy dropped the Joseph from his name and started going by Mark Kennedy. Because in 1953, he published a book called The Pecking Order, and he goes by Mark Kennedy, but there was no information about him, and I was, that's strange. This guy was kind of famous enough to get the book out, promoted by Jet Magazine, and no one knows like what was he doing before, and then I found out he was Joseph Mark Kennedy. He was also older, one generation older than the rest of the guys. Okay, around the same time, their life paths crossed in here in Chicago in the late 1940s. A demographic change induced by the second migration created both tremendous opportunities and formidable challenges for African Americans here in Chicago. On the one hand, Chicago grew into a locus of the Black culture and media industry. The American Negro Exposition, Claude Barnett's Associated Negro Press, Johnson & Johnson's Ebony and Jet magazine, and chess records, blues musicians, such as Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Memphis Slim, and Chuck Berry made Chicago a nodal point of what the historian Adam Green calls the evolving premise of a national Black feeling. On the other hand, the combination of mob violence, urban renewal, and the white flight reinforced the city's residential segregation. Compounded by growing deindustrialization, under-resourced education, and over-policing, the formation of what historian Arnold Hirsch termed the second ghetto signified, perhaps more than anything, the inequitable distribution of post-war prosperity. The Cry of Jazz effectively articulates the historically informed delight and torment of Black life in post-war Chicago. But why does it use an interracial setting? Because it was inspired by the producer's participant observation of interracial dynamics in Hyde Park social life during the 1950s. Despite its closeness to the Black Belt, Hyde Park remained until World War II an exclusively white neighborhood, a white island in the Black Sea. The burst of the Black Belt in the post-war years evoked among the area's middle-class white residents a feeling of the inability of interracialism. As the population of African Americans grew fivefold between 1950 and 1956, nearly 30% of the neighborhood's white residents fled to the suburbs. Running out of patience with the bunch of do-gooders trying to talk their way out of a different situation, the Southeast Chicago Commission, SECC, under the leadership of the University of Chicago, replaced the Hyde Park Kenwood Community Conference as the leading force in the fight against the blight. Reaching resources and political ties, the SECC maneuvered the municipal authorities into enacting legislation that expanded the scope of eminent domain to encompass slum prevention in addition to slum clearance, in clearing approximately 10% of the whole neighborhood, which entailed a displacement of more than 4,000 families of both races. The 1958 Hyde Park Kenwood Urban Renewal Plan rendered Hyde Park a controlled, integrated community of affluent residents. And I think this is the first time I don't have to explain to the audience where Hyde Park is in Chicago. But in case you don't know, that's where Hyde Park is, and we are in Hyde Park. A bustling strip of dining, retail, and entertainment establishments along 55th Street was torn down by the Chicago Land Clearance Commission to make way for University apartment complex. You see two of them, Twin Towers, parking lots, and shopping center, which now houses Trader Joe's today on the Lake Park and 55th. Morton's Restaurant, Como's Pizzeria, the University Tavern, the Clark and Clark Bookseller, the Frolic Theater, and the 55th Street Post Office, all patronized by, quote, an interracial clientele of mixed types, unquote, closed their doors or relocated elsewhere in the city. Now let me show how 55th Street looked like in the 1950s before urban renewal. As part of my research here, I've gathered many photographs. They're either from the special collection here at the U Chicago or the Chicago History Museum. So this is all 55th Street. I mean, it's pretty much nothing in the open spaces. Back in the 50s, they were basically shopping street. Car accident. I think this is looking from Cornell, west. Yeah, there you go. That's part of my research. I've been doing research. Okay, so as Hyde Parkers, the producers of The Cry of Jazz explored the interracial sociality of the short-lived cultural scene that developed around 55th Street. They would socialize with other University of Chicago graduates and dropouts, whom writer Isaac Rosenfeld identified as the retired students. They were, quote, no longer active as students, but still follow the student pattern by habit or imitation, maintain contact with the students, and have a considerable following and a reputation among them as characters, unquote. Of the 38 drinking establishments on 55th Street, Jimmy's, the Compass Tavern, and the University Tavern constituted, quote, the trinity of the university community's watering holes, unquote. Spontaneous and candid debates nightly fill Jimmy's dim lighting interior, decorated with wood panels and panoramic art by Art Castillo. Specialists in various intellectual obsessions gathered around separate table, e.g. the Hegel table, the quantum physics table, the communist table, the science fiction table, so on and so, right? Behind the long mahogany bar sat a reference library to settle heated disputes, containing a set of encyclopedias, Latin and Greek dictionaries, a Bible, and the complete works of Shakespeare. And I think they still do, digitized version or something. As regular customers, Blunt, Hill, and Kennedy would find themselves engaged in spirit discussions among themselves, as well as with other bargoers of various social backgrounds there. Topics often included the latest development in jazz. Jazz figured prominently in the soundscape of pre-urban renewal Hyde Park. According to the recollection of a longtime Hyde Park resident, James Wagner, over the course of the 1950s, Hyde Park boasted between 300 and 400 music venues. He remembered, quote, on any given Sunday, you could listen to jazz up to 4 or 5 in the morning because birds were open till that time, unquote. Much of the neighborhood's music in was concentrated around 47th, 53rd, and 55th Street. Saxophonist Bon Freeman spoke of the club, Sutherland Lounge. The quote, the place was mixed racially. Black and white people would listen together, which was a beautiful thing, unquote. Beehive Lounge on 55th was then designated by Variety as, quote, one of the music spots of major importance within Chicago's booming renaissance of jazz, unquote. While serving people of all backgrounds, the Beehive drew in black jazz enthusiasts primarily alongside mixed couple sitting around the bar. I found the picture of Jimmy's. Look at that, Woodlawn Top. It's the same building, but they don't have the building next, the tall residential building. And this is the only building, I believe, that survived this urban renewal. I think the corner now is Starbucks, unfortunately. That's the art by Art Castillo, and Edo Blunt, and Mark Kennedy, and Nelam Hill were in it. I could point out, but yeah, this is a beautiful artwork. It's still hanging and on the wall of Jimmy's, and yeah, I was there, part of my research. You know, if research includes being a barfly, I would love to.
Did it stay open for all those years?
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, the ownership changed several times, yeah, but yes. Yes, we all should go. This is a file by SECC, Southeast Chicago Commission. The university is kind of shady organization that tried to control the university or the neighborhood. And they have a file for each block of the street in Hyde Park. And I found this one about Jimmy's. I looked into it, and it's like a combination of a scrapbook and a little FBI file. So this was a newspaper came out in 1958 about how Jimmy is not succumbing to the beat generation, but look how closely they were reading the newspaper, like underline everything, and they started writing down the names mentioned. And on top right, you can see Compass Tavern and Jimmy's and University Tavern listed as, I don't know, potential, I don't know. At least they were policing it, the university was. And on the back side, I don't know where the picture's from, but they basically listed the people mentioned it. So it's a little surveillance going on. And they have a file for every block. They usually list the owner of the property and everything. It's really interesting, to say the least. And that's a Beehive. That's a legendary jazz club that also was raised as part of urban renewal. Okay, so I'm hope I'm trying to convince that the cry of jazz was a product, if not the direct historical record of post-Shelley Kramer pre-urban renewal Hyde Park, where interracial residents and visitors immersed themselves in the sound, history, and the subculture of jazz. Reflected in the film's narrative was the producer's struggle to have their awareness of jazz as a distinctive African-American culture practice taken seriously by their white counterparts. In taverns, they would engage in heated discussion with white jazz fans over the music's racial dynamics. Bland recalled, for instance, quote, "We'd hang out a lot at the bar called Jimmy's and get in these arguments with all these jazz critics be," unquote. Emboldened by the rise of West Coast jazz-listening white Hyde Parkers refused to listen to any arguments that Bland would make about the African-American heritage of jazz. He said, quote, "In seeking to take all the credit for its invention and everything else, they were trying to wipe out the blackness of jazz," unquote. That frustration led to the creation of the film. And given the degree of hostility African-American men encountered in Hyde Park's supposedly integrated culture scene, it comes as little surprise that their quest for recognition led to displays of masculinity in an interracial social setting. For the Black producers, as for the film's protagonist, Alex, their assertion of masculinity took the form of exerting control over the minds and bodies of middle-class white women. At the time of the film's production, each one of them was either a marriage or a relationship with a white woman. The integrated haven of Hyde Park did not provide interracial couple with protection from verbal abuse and unwanted stares. Bland and his wife at the time endured constant taunting from white men who would call them pimp and prostitute. The most tangible act of defiance available to Bland and others in that antagonistic environment where racism operated through sexism was to show the white man that he did not serve white womanhood, but possess it. At a time when African-American men were systematically denied their manhood, "I am a man" was a slogan in the civil rights movement, their involvement in interracial intimacy became conflated with their struggle for validity and humanity, especially within a traditionally predominantly white institution and residential areas such as the University of Chicago and Hyde Park. Conversely, African-American women remain absent in the film as they did in the lives of its producers. According to Bland's account, although several Black female actors were approached, they refused to work for free. All actors, including members, worked on a voluntary basis. Certainly, the original cast did include 2 African-American women, but they were nameless 10 other club members with no lines, most likely those who leave the meeting in the opening sequence. It was, in all likelihood, a plausible explanation that the Bland forged in response to Kennedy's call for some sort of answer. By the same token, African-American women held a marginal position in the interracial social life of 1950s Hyde Park. The relative invisibility of Black women resulted principally from a combination of their educational status and Bland and other African men's callous attitude towards them. Even though the University of Chicago had been integrated since the 1920s, African-American women remained underrepresented in Chicago's higher education throughout the 1940s and 1950s. And even with the necessary educational background, instead of pursuing college degree, they were often forced into low-paid domestic services, as the Chicago Maroon addressed in 1951. Or even if Black women participated in the neighborhood social life from time to time, for Bland and other Black men in interracial relationship, the presence of Black women was of relatively less importance than that of white women. Priority was given to enhancing the capacity to place themselves on equal footing with the white men, socially, sexually, and intellectually. One of the most effective means that African-American men adapted was to assert power over white womanhood. Whether deliberate or not, the absence of African women in the cry of jazz stemmed from the producer's complicated relationship with them in real life. And this is probably the most controversial part about the film.
Why is it controversial?
We can talk about a Q&A too. Some people believe Bland didn't make up that was the case. The black women were approached and they refused to work for free. I looked into so many documents about him and other people, and basically black women were not in there. So that, yeah. But we can talk about it. I want to get to the conclusion, and yeah, I want to wrap up this one. The historical significance of the cry of jazz is twofold. In the age of racial integration, racism was purported to manifest itself primarily in the form of individual prejudice, not the concentration of poverty arising from the state-mandated economic deprivation of black Chicagoans. Liberals of the time believed that besides achieving integration and extending human rights, eradicating racism entailed expunging race as a social category from individual conscience altogether. The film's emphasis on racial identity appeared to be moral retrogression, but that was the whole point. As race-neutral sentiments pervaded the discourse of race in 1950s Hyde Park, Bland was aware of the colorblind ideal. At the post-screening discussion, he, quote, gently voiced his mistrust of Northern liberals who thought of Negroes as simply as statistics or social problems, unquote. On the liberal grounds of equality, individualism, and national homogeneity, the white characters depicted in the film abhor any rhetoric of racial self-consciousness articulated by their African-American counterparts. Having navigated Chicago's racially stratified geography throughout the second quarter of the 20th century, Kennedy, Hill, Titus, and Bland grew critical of Hyde Park's liberal and the ideology of racial liberalism. KHTB Productions was not the only group of African-American artists in intellectual in post-war Chicago who combined a structural analysis of black life with a display of an emerging sense of racial identity. During the 1950s, a number of black artists and intellectuals in Chicago created works of art that synthesized modernist aesthetics of abstract expressionism with social realism. Writers Gwendolyn Brooks, Frank London Brown, visual artists Margaret Burrow, Charles White, musician Sun Ra, John Gilmore, and many of the soon-to-be the member of AACM and Art Ensemble Chicago. Too many of them, actually. Referred to collectively as a black avant-garde or black bohemia, their exploration of nascent cultural nationalism signified a rupture from the existing structural and ontological frameworks that have circumscribed the freedom of African Americans. Historians have argued the radical cultural front of the 1930s and 40s was increasingly replaced by McCarthyism during the late 1940s and 50s, which rendered the general cultural climate of the 1950s rather vapid. That means it's boring. In Chicago, however, the black avant-garde, to quote Mary Helen Washington, carried the resistant tradition of the black popular front of the 1930s and 1940s into the 1950s and became a link to the militant politics of 1960 and 1970, unquote. The cry of jazz, too, was a constitutive part of the largely neglected but critical period of African-American history. Its poetics and politics were informed by the lived experiences of Kennedy, Hill, Titus, Bland, and many other black Chicagoans who found, indeed, America's soul to be an empty void. Thank you.
But first off, thank you for everyone being here. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and giving us the chance to watch this film today. I have kind of like two veins of questions that I think you touched upon that I think we can talk about at length, and then I guess maybe then we can open up to everyone else. The first question I have is just on the kind of way that sound, not just actually cinematically, but as a concept and as a history is operating within the film. I was struck by you starting out by talking about how The Cry of Jazz was shown with Birth of a Nation, which is a silent film, and how in between, there's quite a few years in between, but in between that, the first sound film was The Jazz Singer, which featured Al Jolson in blackface, singing jazz to his mother for the first time, right? And I couldn't help but be struck by the kind of parallels of the performance of jazz to Wu or create a sense of like nationalism for the white woman, in this case, a white Jewish woman. And I'm wondering, like, how are you thinking in your research about sound as not just a racialized aspect, but a gendered performance as well?
Thank you. Is it okay? It's a great question. You cannot talk about race without a gender, whether it's it's an image or sound, and so the crowd of jazz. There's no black women in it, obviously. I think we all wish there were black women in it, and I've been trying to figure out why. And we're talking to a bunch of people, looking into archival research, and that was my temporal understanding. Yeah, I'm trying not to defend their decision not to have a work. I'm trying to put it into context of 1950s Hyde Park, and I'm trying to make sense out of it. In terms of the Birth of Nation, the jazz singer and crowd jazz, it's all, as you said, nationalizing effect. And they're also trying to project this film as kind of this emerging expression of this emerging national identity. When I heard first time Alex said this is Black Americanism as opposed to Black chauvinism, I was disappointed. Why are you embracing like UX American exceptionalism? But it turned out, or in my understanding, they are trying to come to terms with their own distinctive identity without not eliminating national togetherness. And there's a great book by Adam Green called Setting the Race, the history professor here. And he makes that argument. The post-World War II years was a moment where the black people came to terms their own identity as a nation and beyond. So that's my understanding of Black Americanism.
No, I was also intrigued by that, specifically thinking about in this moment, the post-war, and this kind of Cold War moment, about like the role that the black male was playing in imperialism, kind of for the first American imperialism for the first time, and how this has like kind of yielded all sorts of wonderful like kind of like intimacies in the meantime of history in terms of like cultural exports, right? They're talking about, in the movie, they go crazy about this overseas, and the one was like, I can't see that happening, right? Yeah, I think maybe like I have myself just a more in a research capacity question, and like, how did you come to this research about like jazz in relation to geography? Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, I'm just curious about that. Coming from, I'm thinking we're both from UCLA. I'm thinking about like what,
Go Bruins,
and how like, you know, in a kind of like, you know, dissertation perspective zone, like how did you come to these decisions?
So my dissertation about the history of jazz fandom and listeners, and I wanted to bring a social study perspective, which is the history of people, basically. And jazz history or music history or cultural history in general talks about musicians and their work, and oftentimes people who listen to it were left out. So I want to bring in listeners into the historical narrative of jazz and music in general. And to do so, I have to find the voices. And oftentimes looking into those voices kind of led me to a certain neighborhood, because I was looking at this case and other case in San Francisco. So it's very locally oriented cases. And the crowd jazz was actually not in my initial dissertation proposal. My advisor suggested it, I could write about it. And he showed the film in the course called the Jazz and Political Imagination. He showed the film. In first lecture, I think he shows the film to set up a tone for the rest of the course, because there's so much going on. And at the time, that blew my mind, but I thought someone has already written about this. And there are a couple articles out there, but they're all from film studies perspective, close reading it. No one has really written about the making of the film historical point of view. So that's how I got into it. And I was totally hooked.
Yeah. I happened to watch this when I was at UCLA in a film class for our historiography class. My former advisor is very much, I'm sure she came across it because of the news clipping that you have of the Birth of a Nation. She writes about Birth of a Nation quite a bit. I did have another question, again, thinking kind of like, I know that your approach is a kind of historical, but I'm so taken by this kind of theoretical, this kind of like Black history retelling as it relates to jazz, and how the same conversation is being had right now about like rap. I don't know if like anyone here is like a Tyler the Creator fan, but Tyler the Creator has a similar, like last week, 4-minute interview clip that is this movie, talking about how suburban white males are like subsuming rap, and like how are we letting this happen, and how has this happened? He points to geography. And Tyler the Creator is from Los Angeles. And so I'm thinking, and like, you know, he's talking about the racial geography of LA and how he can't compute this across the US, which is very different. But I'm thinking about, in your work, if you have any sort of like theoretical, like Black studies theoretical history that you rework or re-engage with as it relates to sound. And specifically, I'm thinking about like a Fred Moten in the break. His kind of idea of the Black radical tradition is that, you know, Aunt Hester, who was a female slave, her scream is what creates the cry of Black sound, right? And situates the beginning of Black American sound to a Black female body. So I'm wondering, how does this appear in your work, if at all?
When I first approached to this film, I was going to use Cedric Robinson, Black Marxism, especially reading Bland's background growing up, and his dad was staunch Marxist, talking about the coming of the working class, and his mother was totally into spiritualism, and Bland talks about they couldn't even speak to each other because they have totally different ideas about life and how the world should be carried out. But that kind of really helped me or inspired me to talk about those things, you know, spiritualism, metaphysics, and the Marxism, structural analysis. But I ended up not using it. Instead of my dissertation uses two theorists. One is Raymond Williams, who is a kind of working class, old school literary scholar from 1950s UK. He critiques like literature from he called it individual. He even said like there's no such thing as authorship because we all are not individual. And I kind of apply, he called it, and then bourgeois cultural history, and then I applied the framework to talk about jazz. It's in the same framework. And the other person I use is Roy DeCarava, who is a photographer. And he had an excellent book collection of photography called The Sound I Saw. And obviously my dissertation is called Sounds We Saw and Visions We Heard. That was a nod to his work. And he has so many interviews in, you know, Callaloo and some other African American or Black diasporic journals. And one of the things he said is for Black artists, art is to be communicated by people who consume and see it. For like white Western tradition, it should be worshipped and just to be looked at. It's not the form of communication. So I bring that to jazz and trying to understand how people communicated with this on their own piece.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I wanted to ask, so the sort of ending point of the film ends on sort of an argument for the death of jazz as a form because of its inability to be developed past the constraints of form, changes, and swing. And I wanted to ask about free jazz, about that history, because I was sort of interested in I mean, that's a very different relationship to all three of those things while still being identifiable as jazz. And I wanted to ask, in terms of time frame, how this film lines up with the development of free jazz and what Bland and the other makers of this film might have had to say later about the development of free jazz.
Thank you for the question. 1959 jazz history is very important time period. Miles Davis, kind of blue, Ornette Coleman, was it the form of jazz to come? It's kind of start of free jazz. And then Dave Brubeck, you can name other people too, but basically they are also trying to break away from bebop dominance. And I think for me, I mean, Blunt is kind of, it's a little hyperbolic guy, and he was also getting into classical music composition, so that's kind of, he also trying to promote his own work as the future of jazz. But true, the free jazz came out, modal jazz came out, and they all were trying to break away from the conventional, or at the point of the formula of jazz. I think the question, because then that's one reason, or another reason why this film was dismissed by jazz critics. Jazz didn't die. But whether you call it jazz or not is, I think, subjective and marketable things. So I think he was right, that he was sensing the limit of bebop, traditional jazz forms. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
This lady next to behind you. Sorry.
May I just a very quick follow-up of the previous question? So I think at the very end of the film, it says that there is a book called The Fruit of the Death of the Jazz.
Right.
So have you figured out any interactions or interplay between the books or the story of the book and also the reception and story of the book and also reception, the story of the jazz, of the film?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
That book is never get published. I don't think they exist. I looked into archive, they don't have it. But they have basically manuscript changed so many times. Basically, Blunt and Mark Kennedy corresponded so much about the content of manuscript. I think the title changed, the content changed. Kennedy was already in New York, and Blunt would write the manuscript and send it to Kennedy. And Kennedy's like, this is not good, so you should change it. But those two guys have basically created the script of the film. This of the Fruit of Jazz it's never there. Yeah, it's not published. I don't think it exists. At least I have not seen it. And Yale University just opened up a Etta Blunt collection. I didn't see it in their collection. Maybe somewhere in the world, but I don't think they exist.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you both. I had a question about the setting of the film, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts as to why the decision was made to set the film in a private space, in someone's home, especially given the context you lay out in the talk about how there were all these vibrant discussions happening in public at bars and things like that. I could imagine like material constraints that would lead them to not want to hire extras or arrange to film somewhere where they would need permission or something like that. But on a kind of like artistic level, do you have thoughts about what that is doing for the film, or like how that is interacting with sort of like what the film was achieving?
Thank you for the questions. The apartment, by the way, is also in Hyde Park. Their friend's apartment, they use it. So one reason, definitely political economy. They didn't have much money to rent out a space, or definitely just book a bar or something. But Blunt also said, if it was a bar as the setting, people would think, okay, these guys are just drunk, just arguing because they're drunk for the fun. They just, It's good. The reason why he made this film, or they made this film, is they want to be taken seriously. So it has to be some form of organization, which is Jazz Appreciation Club. They use it. So they want to be taken seriously. That's why they didn't choose a bar as well. I sound like I made a film.
I have so many questions, but I'm going to try to maybe come back to this question about death, because I'm really struck by the kind of just the general discussion of blackness as a futureless future, and then kind of thinking about the body, which comes up a lot. then in relation to the spirit, right? And the question of like the death of a movement, right? And actually, before Tyler, the Creator, actually was thinking about Greg Tate a lot, right? And the death of hip hop and like that kind of discussion in the kind of early 2000s. And so I guess I'm really interested in your take on kind of the specter of death, maybe writ large, as it runs through the film and like in these many layers. And a sense of, because I was looking at this and maybe really thinking about maybe contemporary discourse of Afro-pessimism and a kind of sense of kind of the inescapability of Black death and a sense of like, I mean, how does one get beyond this, or kind of how does one think about like a movement or a form, like an artistic form and the potential for something that leads you out of the cul-de-sac of death?
That's a great point, especially Afro-pessimism. I decided not to go down that route. And I tried to read this deathness, if you will, in the political economy of Chicago. Because Chicago was so segregated when the rest of the nation was desegregated during the civil rights movement. There's so many social studies that actually they put in the numbers, and the residential segregation got more and more intense during the 1950s. And you know, so many other cities usually desegregated, and the next goal is to have Black politicians. We had a Black politician here named William Dawson, who was part of the Democratic machine. He collected votes, decided not to change anything, so they couldn't also go to politics, or policy, or housing. And that's why they have to go to art to envision something new. So to me, the deathness envision a kind of rupture. We have to break away from this. So that's why I said it's kind of hopeful take, but that's my take. Thank you.
My name is Kerfak Reldeen. I'm the University Archivist at Chicago State. And bringing up Afro-pessimism is really interesting for something that we're working on, which is the papers of Lerone Bennett, the Ebony editor who did Before the Mayflower in '62. And I guess I was just wondering if you could direct me to any other contextual information for Afro-pessimism around that time. Around the time of late 50s, early 60s, you know, to get a better sense of it. I haven't really looked through the Ebony archives yet, but if you know any other major documents of it, or?
I mean, I think you could look into kind of, it's interesting that you bring up that like Bland's father was a Marxist and his mother was a spiritualist, because
sounds like something out of a novel.
Yeah, no, but it's in this conversation, I think, of Marxism and like Black spiritualism. Like, there's always been a desire to not have a fear of death, especially given the history of Blackness in America. So I think like maybe in the 50s and 60s, you might want to try and find in like magazines, like how are they talking about people who are spiritualists, who identify as spiritualists. I think that someone like Amiri Baraka, I don't know if that was his name at the time. I can't remember what the
Leroy
switch happened.
Jones.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was like, would have been talking about this, and like in the 50s were still, I think, hopeful. That was like a tough part. I think when the 60s turned, that's when everyone was like, oh, shit's gone. It was never really happening. So in the 60s, I think you'd have a better chance of also looking at some of the people in Afro-Cobra who were coming up from underneath some of the artists that were mentioned. Mm-hmm. So in the archives, I think at the Southside Arts Community Center, they'll have a really strong history of the conversations that some of those artists were having about why they wanted to have these public art pieces put up across Hyde Park and in the Chicago South Side. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking, now I'm blanking. I literally put the archive together, so I'm telling you right now.
Okay, great.
There's two artists who I think would have been thinking in their work, they had a similar kind of preoccupation of not wanting to shy away from death, or thinking of death as being intrinsic to Black Americanness. That would be in that archive.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
I have another question. Sorry. If I can, I'm really curious about the mention of kind of reading this more as semi-autobiography as opposed to semi-documentary, because you brought up Roy DeCarava, who was also very much on my mind as someone who, like, the Sweet Fly Paper of Life might really is like the paradigm of like the semi-documentary mode, and kind of his teaming up with Langston Hughes. And I was thinking about that a lot as I was watching this, is like, you know, is that a kind of model, or is that, you know, and thinking of that as 1955, why semi-autobiography kind of over the potential of reading this as semi-documentary?
Well, the more research I did into their lives, it's just a reflection of their life. They were hanging out Jimmy's in here, and they all had a white women as their partners, and they did discuss jazz extensively, heatedly, and it's definitely a reflection of their own life. And it does contain kind of rare footage of South Side of Chicago from the time. It's mostly 6th and Cottage Grove Avenue. Most of them are there. Also, it is definitely, the film could have only been made in here, Hyde Park, I would say. Post-1948, but pre-urban renewal, Hyde Park, definitely. But interesting point also, DeCarava's Sweet Fly Paper. I love the book. And if DeCarava is hopeful, maybe Golden Parks is Afro-pessimism. You could make that argument. They depicted a very different pictures of everyday life in Harlem and other black communities.
Sorry for another question. So I'm actually very curious about the statues of the black African women which occur so many times. I assume that for the white people there, it's more like exotic statues. So I'm just curious about what's the attitudes. What do you think the attitudes of the directors towards that statue? Because I think, yeah, that statue with extremely long neck. I'm from a Chinese background, so if it's like, you know, small feet, it's considered as something, you know, like backward, or like it's just like the feudal residuals and something unpleasant. But it seems that it's considered something spiritual in this film. So I'm just curious about if there's any story that I'm not unaware of. Yes.
Yeah, so if you read those 3 or 4 articles out there from film studies perspective, they always analyze it because it's very important. Every time the setting changes, they always signify difference. But then Blanc said, I think the artistic director was Bernard Goss, who was, I believe, the first husband of Margaret Taylor. And he's the only black person involved in making this film. Everyone else, 64 volunteers, all white from Hyde Park mostly. I think his statue, he had it, and he brought it and put it on. That's a good question. Or Bernard Goss made it, or he happened to have it from Africa. I don't know. And that's another thing I'm trying to figure out. What's the connection between those 4 producers and Margaret Taylor and other artists? I think Margaret Taylor's name was mentioned in the list of who borrowed the print. So I'm sure she have shown the film, maybe Southside Community Center or someone else, but I haven't found it. I'm trying to find it. Oh, by the way, his father did correspond with Margaret Taylor, Blanc's father. Yeah.
I have a question. I think if everybody can hear me. I know that the film at the time it wasn't any great success, right? Thank you. In your research, even though there wasn't a lot of attention given to it, did you maybe come across any other recognition or mention in the Chicago Defender or the Beehive or Chicago Bee, I mean to say, or any of the those are the 2 black newspapers that I think of. I don't know.
Yeah, they did promote it, the film. You know, the film was made and they had a film screening or premiere at the Lincoln Center here in Chicago. So that was a little boosting of the film, but not necessarily enthusiastic response. So the two kind of people who found the film excellent and fascinating, one is Amir Baraka. He acknowledged this film had an influence on his thinking. If you read The Blues People or something, it's very similar line. And that book came out in 1963. This is 1959, what made it in 1958. The other group of people who found this film really interesting, amazing, are the group from New York, underground, kind of experimental filmmaking people, artistic film, experimental film. I think one guy named is Jonas Mikus. I think he's a well-known figure in the independent art film scene. He found this film to be like the best film ever. So he supported. And Edelbland was invited to his kind of collective of filmmakers. So yeah, those.
So in certain niches there was
commercial
attention.
success. Yeah. They even like the kind of wooden acting and bad cinematography as authentic. Anti-Hollywood, anti-Hollywood. That was the word they were using.
I'm in my 80s, and I just recently started to read the poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks and found out so much more about the way she saw, the whole picture of Black life in Chicago. And it was really fascinating to me because I knew Gwendolyn Brooks was our, what do you call that, poet laureate, but never was ambitious enough to read it. And this kind of reminded me of what was going on that they weren't dealing with, because they weren't really talking about Black women. But I was just wondering, if she was approached, about this film or a film that could really explicate what was going on, in Chicago at that time.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Gwendolyn. Gwendolyn was actually, and I think I'm okay to say this, Gwendolyn was a lover of Edelbland's father.
Oh.
So one of the books she wrote, if you read the dedication, she dedicated the book to Edelbland Sr., who passed away during World War II, who was killed in World War. So they were definitely knew each other in the same writing groups and everything.
Yes.
I don't think she was approached to appear in the film, but Gwendolyn Brooks is another figure that from the 1940s cultural front moment and went into all the way to 60s Black arts movement and proclaimed that I'm going to be a Black artist as well. So in Chicago, there was no gap in between cultural front and Black arts. They're linked by similar or the same artist, and part of the reason they could do this, I think, is they built the institutions. Margaret Taylor and other people built the institution, passed down the knowledge. It was really unique to Chicago, I think. And also Chicago had a very difficult time of racism. So
Yes.
I think, I don't know if I can call it Chicago exceptionalism, but 1950 Chicago was on time, not ahead of time, if you understand the context of 1950 Chicago.
Yeah. Thank you. That's so interesting.
Do you remember which Brooks book that is dedicated to him?
Is it one of the books that got a Pulitzer, maybe?
Annie Allen?
Potentially, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'll check.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It should say, I'm going to dedicate this book to Edelbland's father. Edelbland Sr.
I didn't call time because we started a little late, just because we wanted to, make sure that, we had heard a couple of people were on their way, and so we waited an extra few minutes. And I'm so happy that we had this conversation, and Masa, I'm just really proud of the research you're doing, and will have done and continuing to do. And I know that you will keep us informed at the BMRC and update us. And we wish you well going forward. I know you've pretty much finished up your time here.
Yeah, I leave tomorrow.
Yes. All right. And and we certainly encourage you to reach back out if there's anything that we can do for you in the future in supporting your research. Thanks again.